Hello, I trust you are well and happy. Thanks for joining us on this program of A Very Tall Man. Well, my next guest, I'll tell you more about him in a moment, but let me just set it up for you. Imagine it's Thursday, it's October the 11th, and it's a hotel in Brighton in England. And my next guest has decided it's time for bed. He's got his pajamas on, he's brushed his teeth, he's phoned his wife, and he's set his alarm, and it's to go off at 7 o'clock the next morning.
Oh, I just wish it had been like that.
Because at 3 a.m. something dramatic happened. Harvey Thomas, thanks for joining us on the program. What happened at 3 o'clock in the morning?
A bomb that was 5 feet under my bed in the roof of the room underneath me just went off. So, I mean, at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was an IRA bomb, and so I and the bed and everything else went up through the roof of the Grand Hotel because we were on the top floor.
Now, you were in the Grand Hotel because it was
It was a conference hotel for the Conservative Party led by Mrs. Thatcher and the conference. And I was the director of the conference as the director of press and communications for the Conservative Party. So I'd given myself a nice room, actually, looking out at the sea. And the bomb went off and I shot through the roof of this hotel, apparently bursting water pipes on the way up, and then crashed down 3 floors. And my body caught on a sort of a steel girder sticking out 3 floors down. And they told me that 10 tons of rubble fell on top of me. And Neil Kinnock, who was a socialist leader, said afterwards, "Your substantial bulk saved you." So that's my excuse.
Well, we smile about that part, but of course it was a tragedy on the night.
It was a terrible occasion in many ways, and the IRA had been sort of planning how to attack things, and we had expected the miners. This was a time during the miners' strike in the 1980s, 1984, and we were expecting public demonstrations from the miners, but they never showed up. Interestingly, they were cancelled before the bomb, which indicates some kind of liaison in the background there. We were expecting that. We were not expecting no intelligence on IRA activity, but they placed the bomb there about 2.5 weeks beforehand and put a video timer on it to go off at that time with the attempt to kill the Prime Minister.
And the Prime Minister obviously survived, but others did not.
No, 5 of our friends were killed. One of them was in the room next to me, 2 of them were in the room underneath me, and Norman Tebbit was terribly badly injured. He was down a couple of floors. Mrs. Thatcher was, if you're looking at the seaside kind of thing, off to the right a little bit, and therefore not quite where the roof collapsed. What happened was that the bomb went off, and there was this huge chimney, like about 10 feet tall, that weighed goodness knows how many tons. And when the bomb went off, it dislodged the foundations. So there was a gap, and the bomb went off, and I landed, and I could hear people calling out for help. And then there was a sort of few moments of silence, and then suddenly this chimney went down like a knife through butter through all 7 floors. And that's what did most of the damage and killed most of the people, actually, rather than the bomb itself.
How badly injured were you, Harvey?
Very, very little. Scratches and bruises.
Your considerable bulk saved you.
My considerable bulk saved me. But 5 friends were killed, and a number of others were seriously injured. Norman Tebbit was the worst. He really suffered. He and his wife, Margaret. He was a cabinet minister at the time, and he really suffered. He was crushed, and he stayed they got me out. The bomb went off at 5 to 3, actually, and then they dug me out at about 20 to 6 from under the rubble. And they didn't get him out until about 6:30, and he was very badly crushed. And 9 years later, he was still having skin grafts. And his wife, Margaret, was paralyzed completely and could hardly do anything. She could hardly even take her hand and just do that. She couldn't do it. And so that was a real tragedy for those who were seriously injured. So in fact, I came out of it very, very lightly indeed.
We know Margaret Thatcher as the Iron Lady, that expression, but that would have knocked her around that night, I would imagine.
It more proved her mettle, in a sense. It proved she was an Iron Lady because she was emotional. She was very, very loyal, extremely loyal to her friends and her partners and co-workers. And she was just out of the main crashing down of the bomb in the middle of the hotel. And the bathroom was completely wrecked, her bathroom, and she and Dennis were there. But I never had any doubt from the moment it went off and the moment they got me out that the conference would go on the following morning. And I called my secretary as soon as I could get to a hotel. I called Marlies first of all, because Marlies, my wife, was 9 and a bit months pregnant with Leah, our first daughter, who is now a gorgeous 35. And so she wasn't with me, because she wouldn't have survived, I think, that kind of a up 1 floor, down 3 and 10 tons of rubble. But I called her first to say I'm okay. Then I called my secretary, who was in a different hotel, and said, get into the hall and do the checklist, everything we do, because I was directing the conference, because I'm sure Margaret will want to go ahead. And she did. One of the more well-known shots of Margaret after the bomb was her saying to the BBC political editor, the conference will go on as normal. Did you get that, John? It'll go on as normal. And then we went on. I got back into the hall at about 10:30.
One of the things that has amazed me about that story is you made a point of going and finding the bomber at some point. What was the story around that?
Well, at some point, I think, is the key element there, because this was 1984. Pat McGee, who put the bomb there about 2.5 weeks beforehand, was caught in Glasgow in Scotland in 1985. He was sentenced and convicted of 5 murders and half a dozen attempted murders. And he went to jail for life. And that was in 1985. Now, time went on, and in 1998, that's 14 years after the bomb itself, I was actually preaching in Louisville, Kentucky at St. Matthew's Church. And I was preaching on forgiveness on Matthew chapter 6. And as I read it, it dawned on me that for 14 years, I'd talked about forgiveness as a Christian, but had never actually done it. As far as Pat McGee and co were concerned. So I went back and told Marlies, and we prayed about it, and I wrote to Pat, who was then in the Maze prison in Northern Ireland, and he'd been there for 14 years. And I said, look, I'm writing as a Christian to say I forgive you for what you did, but I can only speak on my own account personally. I have no right to speak on behalf of anyone else. And he wrote a very thoughtful letter. Actually, he's a delightful guy. It sounds weird to say so, but he's a very soft person. He's a doctor of philosophy. He's well educated, and he went into the IRA because, as a nationalist who wanted to have a single Ireland and a lapsed Catholic, he calls himself. He said, I watched what was happening. We talked, and the British government didn't listen. And finally, I found that 4 of my friends were shot and killed by the British Army in what is known as Bloody Sunday. And he said they were unarmed, and I thought, enough is enough. I'll join the IRA and we'll go to war with the British government. And that's how he got into it. But I wrote to him and I said, I forgive you. And he wrote back, he said, we have clearly different views on this, etc. In 1998. In 2000, he was released under an amnesty. He'd served 15 years in jail.
So have you met him?
Oh yes, he's a close friend now. We're a family friend.
Hang on, go back. He's a close friend.
Yes, Pat and we've done 4 or 5 programs together. Matter of fact, we're doing another one in 2020, where we work together and discuss these whole things. Because when I first met him, I went to see him when he got out in 2000, I think it was, and we chatted and. He thought I'd have security with me and everything as a senior official in that government. And I didn't. I just flew to Dublin and met him. And he said, for me, this was like a submarine captain in the war. You put your periscope up and you say, my job is to sink that enemy aircraft carrier. You don't say, oh, whoopee, I can kill somebody. He said, and now you realize how much hurt you cause, you take a different view on it. But that was his view at the time. And so we met the first time in 2000. Then he came over to the UK in 2001, and I introduced Leah and Marlies to him, and our youngest daughter, Lani.
Well, that must have been a moment, because it was possible that he had killed you.
Oh, it was very likely that he would have killed me. In fact, we took him home to breakfast because he came on an early morning flight from Dublin, and Marlies had done baked beans, and we sat around our breakfast table having baked beans. And Lani, who's our youngest daughter, she was born 2 years after the bomb. And she looks at Pat and says, Pat, you do realize if you'd succeed in killing Daddy, I wouldn't be here. And he was very, very touched. And it's interesting when you look at the difference between the violence of the IRA and modern violence, what we call terrorism. I have no pluses for either of them. That's quite clear. Both are totally wrong. But there was a difference in them, and that was that with the IRA, they considered they had legitimate targets of people who were in political positions, and that they would try and avoid what they called collateral damage as much as was possible. Whereas in modern terrorism, it's kill everybody who's within sight. Neither is in any way good. It's all bad, but they are different. And so his concern was that, as later years he got to know Marlies well, that, gosh, I could have killed her if she'd been there, and that was worrying him.
Can I go back to the forgiveness thing for a second?
Yeah.
Did he understand what you meant by "I forgive you"?
Yes, he did, and he wrote and he said, "Thank you very much." And he said, clearly I'd look at things differently, and then we talked later. But he did say, we meet so many times now, we're in regular touch, and have been for many years. But he said, normally if you have a reconciliation between people, there are protocols, and if you look at the Israeli-Palestine, you look at all the IRA and all the rest of it, there are protocols you go through. He said, but you just come just because of your faith and say, "I forgive you, it's over, put it aside." And I said, yes, that's what. And my shame is that it took me 14 years to actually think about doing it. People say, "Gosh."
But you did it, Harvey.
Well, yes, but people say, "Gosh, you forgave him." But it was 14 years. I can't claim any spiritual credit for it. It was a long time before I realized that I was lacking myself.
Did it change your life?
The balm or the forgiveness?
Both.
The balm, yes, because in a very funny kind of way, because it became an event that I had come through virtually unscathed. I mean, yes, cuts and bruises and all sorts of other nasty things, but nothing serious, no structural damage. And so and then people would notice that I'd been through it, and they'd ask me to talk about it and talk about security and other things, because I was the director of the conference, so they'd ask about security. Forgiveness, yes, it's enlightened me a great deal, because Jesus in Matthew chapter 6, after the Lord's Prayer, which is, we all know, he then goes on to say, you must forgive people. If you do, God will forgive you. If you do not forgive others, God will not forgive you. Matthew 6, 14, 15, I think it is, right around that verse. And so it struck me then that it had been a long time that I had not thought about forgiving people. And that when I did forgive, it made such a difference. And Pat is now involved in reconciliation work himself. And it's a totally different situation now.
And you've gone from the Conservative Party to spending a number of years working for Billy Graham, who of course preaches and taught about the man who was the ultimate forgiver.
Yeah, well, of course, Billy Graham came first. In other words, I was with Billy Graham before I went to the Conservative Party.
Beg your pardon.
And it's kind of interesting, because the first rally I did for Mrs. Thatcher, Time magazine wrote to say, if you thought that the rally and the Thatcher election was a bit Nuremberg in style, it's because Harvey Thomas directed it and he produced the Billy Graham crusade, which is not entirely complimentary. But I'd spent 15 years with Billy Graham, and that was unbelievable as far as experience is concerned, because he, like Mrs. Thatcher, there were great similarities between them. They were both convinced Christians. They were both very good on vision and the big picture. They were both an absolute disaster if you allowed them to get into detail. And you could let them get involved in detail, and you really got trouble, micromanagement. So you had to sort of keep them both out of that. But they were very similar in many ways, and they were both intensely loyal and very firm in their conviction. So I think in my 14 years with Margaret Thatcher, the thing I heard her say most was, no, we've got to do it this way because it's right. Now, whether she was or not, I fully recognize people will think all sorts of different things. But her motive for doing things was that she believed it was the right thing to do. And it was the same thing with Billy Graham. All the time, he was exactly the same off stage as he was on stage, genuine all the way through. And that I see a great lack of in today's political and religious, in some cases, world.
Well, not only did you work for Billy Graham, but you've been involved with politics around the world. It wasn't all that long ago that we heard the news of the death of Robert Mugabe, the African...
Yeah, southern from Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe,
yes.
the president. We have this idea of him being a tyrant. Is that a fair picture?
It's a terribly difficult question to answer because I liked him. He was a little fellow, and I met him on many occasions because I produced some what they call smart partnership dialogues, which is public sector, private sector dialogues between the countries of various countries in Africa, all sorts of Africa, and also China was involved, the UK was involved, Canada was involved, in public sector, private sector partnerships and how you develop a nation with public sector and private sector. So I met Mugabe on many, many occasions. On one occasion, and he was always sweet is almost the word. And I'm not saying he was, but to me, this was the impression I got. He was almost sweet. He was chuckling and laughing and very, very pleasant and personal. And he said to me, "Do you think you can change the British newspapers' view of me?" So I said, "Well," I said, "I probably could." He said, "Well, what would you do?" I said, "Well, I would tell you to pick a dozen of the well-known leading journalists in the United Kingdom and give them free tickets to Zimbabwe and a car when they got there, no restrictions, no guards, no supervision, let them loose in the country for a week. And you'll get a very, very fair deal. If you have nothing to hide, you'll come out looking great. If you do, they'll find it." I said, "So that's the answer to the question." And he said, "I don't think we could quite get away with doing that."
And then you moved a little further south and did some work for F.W. de Klerk in South Africa, right?
Yes, he's a marvellous man, F.W. de Klerk, also a very fine Christian fellow. I led his tour, his election campaign against Nelson Mandela, in which our objective was a peaceful handover to Mandela, not to win the election, in 1994. And every meeting began with prayer. And again, de Klerk was one of those people who said, "It's not what's good for us or the party, it's what's good for South Africa."
Isn't that a wee bit complicated and a little bit sort of like, you take South Africa that had this terrible policy of apartheid, yet they said they were Christians.
Well, it is. But then when you look, you see, in America, in the United States, in very general terms, if you are Christian, you vote Republican. I mean, I'm being very general now. In the United Kingdom, if you are, quote, Christian, you're much more likely to vote Liberal or Socialist. In other parts of Europe, you've got Christian Democrats and Christian Socialists. So the political views are all completely different. And there were many ways in which de Klerk, well, he changed the whole country, in which de Klerk led the way from a Christian point of view. He was also dealing with the Zulus, for example, with Chief Buthelezi, who is a Christian fellow, and Michael Cassidy, who was the founder of an organization, mission organization called African Enterprise, which has representatives in many different parts of the world. And they, when they looked at the election, they tried to get everybody involved, and they had prayer meetings in all sorts of different places, including de Klerk. Now, Mandela was not a Christian. He was a remarkable man. I met him on, 4 or 5 occasions. I would say that he was an extraordinary man. I don't know if you've been to South Africa or been to Cape Town, but Robben Island, where he was imprisoned, anybody who can survive 15 years in that thing and come out as graciously as he did was a remarkable person. I found him very gentle. He is very, very tall. And you're very tall. I'm pretty tall, and he's a very tall fellow. And I worked with him and in the smart partnerships in Mozambique and in Uganda and in Zimbabwe. The campaign that we ran, it seems like complicated. It seems like controversial because Christian and apartheid, but actually, many Christians felt that apartheid was the best way. And when you look back, history will probably show a different situation, in as much as, jumping to Ireland, history will probably show that violence was necessary to come to peace in Northern Ireland, even though as a Christian I would be 100% against it.
There'll be people who are watching this who are raising their eyebrows at this moment.
Yeah, because I would not for a moment condone either apartheid or anything else, but in those lines. But the fact is that you've got a real situation, and you can't pretend that the situation is something you'd like it to be. And the situation was that there was apartheid, and de Klerk almost did a coup to get himself as leader of the party and change that apartheid. That was his conviction. He brought one man, one vote, and he brought Mandela out of prison. So he was a fine Christian, and is a fine Christian. And there is, of course, that conflict. But there's also the point of view of the way in which Christians in developed evangelical circles in the Western world look at things, and the way that people in Asia look at things, Christians, and the way that Christians in South America, or for that matter, Africa look at things, can be completely different. Even though I don't understand it all, I can't explain it all, but it can be different. And now I look at Pat McGee, the Brighton bomber. I totally disagree with everything he did. I think it was absolutely wrong. It was non-Christian, unbiblical. But I can understand his thinking as to how he got there. But that was the situation. So my point of view was, how do I share Christ with him? And how do I bring it back? So it's not easy, and you can't, in some of the Democratic primaries in the United States, Bernie Sanders has been quoted was quoted as saying that there were good things in Cuba. And he's actually right. Hitler, who was one of the monsters of history, did a huge amount for the German economy and built the Autobahn system. So there are things that are not necessarily evil because the person is evil and the masses thing is evil. There are small things in there. And I think that de Klerk saw the evil of apartheid and pushed himself up to get rid of it.
Do you think in this day and age that we become so narrow in what we believe that it's like we believe this and then everyone else is wrong? Is that part of the problem?
It's very much part of the problem, because if you look at what is happening with the church, pretty well worldwide, is that millions of small groups are springing up to be independent churches. You've got all the, quote, new churches, close quote. And they call themselves everything from New Frontiers to New Covenant to New everything. And it's the same syndrome that you have in what we used to have in Century Boulevard in Los Angeles, where at the one end of the airport end of Century Boulevard, there's a church called the Church of God. And about a mile up the road, the breakaway group is called the Only Church of God. And the next one up, there's another one, the Only True Church of God. And the fourth one up, there's the One and Only Church. And so everybody's doing their own thing. And I think that's a shame. And probably the reason is that there is no longer simple Bible teaching happening in the John Stott era, that kind of teaching, nearly as much as there used to be, with the result that people are going off on their own directions and making their own choices, and that is not good for the church.
So how do you decide what is right?
You can only decide by what the Bible says. As far as a Christian is concerned, you can only decide what the Bible says. And this again gets people into trouble. When I've had difficulty talking about some subjects when they said, what does the Bible say about so-and-so? And I said, well, the Bible says this. Now, that saved Billy Graham in his ministry. Saved is the wrong word, but I mean that encouraged his ministry because he stuck with the Bible. And this is what the Bible says. The J. Vernon McGee of the Church of the Open Door in Los Angeles, always what the Bible says. And that's the only way you can decide. But there are some things that it's terribly difficult to decide, and whether they're political or, for example, European Christians would say, why do Americans, Christians, all vote Republican? And if you say to an American conservative, European Christians vote socialist, they couldn't understand it. And yet it's there. We're going to find some funny people up in heaven, I think. But it's a fact. You've got to deal with the situation as it really is. And that's not always very simple.
So looking back over the years, because you're now in your 80s, it's hard to believe it, but in his 80s, are you hopeful for Christianity going forward?
I'm hopeful in the sense that I believe God's got his hand on it and God is guiding it somewhere. I don't understand where sometimes, because when I look at some of the things that happen, I don't understand them. But was it Abraham Lincoln who said, I'll take as much of the Bible as I can by reason and the rest by faith? I think it was Abraham Lincoln. And somewhere along the line, we're not going to understand everything. But yes, I am hopeful. And I'm hopeful because there are still a core of committed, devoted Christian believers who don't feel they have to prove themselves. So many people these days feel I must write a spiritual book, otherwise no one will think I'm a Christian, whatever it is. And there are some very good ones. But equally, there are thousands of these Christian books. I mean, I've had to chuck out about 40 big hardbacks from my office in London because there's just too much of it. And nobody's saying anything different from what we all said when the Bible said it 40, 50, 60 years ago. So I am hopeful that the faithful, whoever they are, whatever denomination, whatever group, will stick in there and stand up for it and plough on, if that's the right word, with faith that the Lord will take them through.
And are you still a Sunday church goer, worshipper?
Yes. How do you mean? You mean
Yeah,
Sunday?
because for so many people today say, I don't need to go to church on a Sunday.
Oh,
I
I
don't
see.
need to be connected.
No, whenever I can, I do. There's certain sometimes I can't. Marlies is a deacon in our church. I couldn't be a deacon because I can't always get there because of various medical things that make it difficult for me always to be out. But yes, I'm a member of Oakwood Baptist Church in London, and I think that's invaluable. But in one sense, I wish I had more time. Today we're all rushed and all instantaneous. We don't take the time to select and think about things, and everything has to be in, emails, Instagram, Facebook, all these different kind of things. The number of people who have been damaged by pressing the wrong button, reply all, and all this kind of thing. We're in an age which is being rushed everywhere, and I think that a local church with a good fellowship and a good Bible teaching is very, very valuable to Christian believers, whatever the denomination, whatever the group.
Harvey, thank you very much for the time that you've given us over the last half hour or so. It's been a pleasure and a delight to catch up again and to hear some of the stories and share some of your wonderful memories. And I'm just so glad that bomb did not kill you. God bless you. God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.